What's going on, everybody? Welcome to We the People podcast. My name is Brett Maurer, and today we are talking about kind of an exciting topic. So, today is Ragnar Day, and for those of you that are fans of the television show Vikings, that is the exact Ragnar that I am talking about. Today is Ragnar Day, and it is the day that uh, Ragnar Lothbrok led his siege on the city of Paris. Now, before I really talk about the event, I just want to clear a couple things up. And the first thing I want to clear up is who Ragnar Lothbrok really was. Now, this is where we have some issues as historians and as people who look to learn history or even teach it. Um, Ragnar Lothbrok is a legendary character in sagas and things of that nature. Um, he was a war chief, he was a king, he was a Norse hero. There's so many different oral stories and sagas about the achievements and, uh, his different raids and wars and battles, things like that he was involved in. The problem is we don't know what necessarily is true and what is fabricated to enhance his image or his legend. We know that there are some events that happened, like the siege of Paris, that the Ragnar Lothbrok was involved with, did lead, things like that. And we know that from primary source records, such as, say an Anglo-Saxon monk who wrote down the events of what was happening. But there are some that are spoken about in the oral stories and the sagas that we can't necessarily verify. And so we're not sure if it actually happened. Historians today do believe that Ragnar Lothbrok, at least the one from the sagas, was a combination of different Viking leaders or kings or war chiefs or things like that. They believe that the stories were basically taken from multiple different Viking heroes and combined to enhance Ragnar's fame. Again, this is just what historians speculate. We do know that the actual Ragnar Lothbrok did participate in a lot of the events that we know about, and that we do have record of that. And I think the biggest one that he was involved with, at least in my opinion, is the siege of Paris, the raid of Paris. So that takes us back to the year 845, the 29th of March, 845. Today is Ragnar Day. We see during this time a war chief. This war chief, at least in the texts, because remember, we're talking about the 9th century, and we are talking about people speaking very old English, more towards Latin roots, things like that. The name of this war chief was written as Regeneris. I may have actually mispronounced that. I apologize. I don't necessarily know how to fully read the Old English text, but from my research, that was the name that was given. And this was one of the Norse chieftains that was believed to have been an inspiration for the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok. This was the name of the actual chieftain that raided Paris. We don't know if that is the proper identity of Ragnar Lothbrok, simply because of all of the tales that seem to be mixed into who this legend was. So this chieftain um, opened the door for what would be kind of a plague, I want to say, for the city of Paris. He opened the door for Paris to be raided. And it would continue to be raided for quite some time after that. So the siege of Paris, the first siege of Paris, I need to add, was this culmination of different Viking invasions in France, or at the time it was called Francia. And once again, we know that the Norse forces, the Danish forces, the Vikings were led by who we believe was one of the war chiefs to be associated with the story of Ragnar Lothbrok. There was basically this fleet, okay, and the fleet consisted of about 120 ships, which held the equivalent of roughly estimated in the modern day 4,000 to 5,000 men. So you have 4,000 to 5,000 Viking warriors, okay, that are loaded up on about 120 dragon longships. This came as a response to the Frankish Empire having attacked Viking raiders in 799. This was about 10 years after what we think was the first Viking attack in England. So 10 years after the first Viking attack in England, the Frankish Empire attacks Viking raiders. So this is 799. This led Charlemagne, and for those who don't know, Charlemagne was also known as, I think, Charles the First, and he was, excuse me, he was the king of the Franks from roughly 768 to about 814. And he had other titles also. He was considered king of the Lombards, which he had once again reigned from 774 till about 814. He was the emperor of the Caroline Empire. And basically that was, so when his father had died, his father divided his entire kingdom into two parts. He gave half of it to Charlemagne and the other half to his other son. And basically when his other son died, Charlemagne took the power of all of the kingdom. And this became the, what's the word I'm looking for? Largest. This became the largest empire since the fall of the Romans. And basically, Charlemagne pretty much went to war with everybody. And so, looking back over history, he went to war with the Italians, taking over much of the Italian region, the region of Italy. He went to war with the Saxons. For those who don't know, there at this time he went to war with the Germanic Saxons, and this became known as the Saxon Wars. It was basically a 33-year war that lasted, and Charlemagne had the intent to conquer, and basically take over what is now today the German region. And so what this resulted in was it basically created the incorporation of Saxon peoples and beliefs into French peoples and beliefs, and it basically forced the Saxons, who were considered Germanic pagans, to switch to Christianity. And Christianity then took on different aspects from Germanic paganism. But that is, basically the short version of what happened with the Saxon Wars. That being said, the Frankish Empire in 799, so still under the rule of Charlemagne, launched an attack on these Viking raiders. This was 10 years after the Viking attack in Dorset, England, or modern-day Dorset, England. And it basically led Charlemagne to create a defense system along the northern coast. And he created this defense system in 810. And basically, what this was it was a system, it was a series of, different points, different checkpoints that were basically set up in order to deter Viking raiders. According to historians, and it would make sense, you have ships with small amounts of raiders on them, okay? If you're a typical group of Viking raiders, you're going to go for the place that is not necessarily so heavily guarded. You're going to go to a place where there may be less soldiers, maybe more farmers, and because you're going to face less resistance. Also, you may be more likely to target a monastery, because typically at this time, and even now today, places of worship tend to have less armed soldiers and armed civilians. I mean, not that it's necessarily the same in the modern day, because we are not in any way, shape, or form the same anymore. But let's put it into a modern perspective. Think about the church close to your house or in your neighborhood or something like that. Now, let's say that this was a church in the 700-800s. Churches, monasteries, places like that were more likely to have precious items, precious metals. They had gold, they had silver, maybe, jewels, things like that were given to them by the crown, that were given to them as tribute from, citizens or something like that. And, they would have gold candlesticks, or maybe a gold crucifix, maybe silver. There would be many crops, because maybe payment was made to the church in crops, And so now think about the church close to your house and think, how many police officers are there typically on a normal day around or inside that church? How about soldiers? How many, American soldiers are there? Or British soldiers, or wherever you're living right now? Probably not many, right? Well, the Vikings in the 7 and 800s are going to notice that too. And they're going to go, there's not a ton of soldiers, but they have crops. They have precious metals. Logically, if you are a small raiding party, you're more likely to attack that monastery or that church or maybe that farming village. Okay? Now, it's also important to point out that Vikings did not only raid. Okay? Yes, there were some clans that raided more than others, but the main focus that Vikings had, especially during this time, the main focus that the Norse and Danish settlers had. I shouldn't say Viking because Viking is not a people. Vikings are not a type of people. Viking was a occupation. It was an occupation. Okay. A Viking then, you know, could be the equivalent of a Black Ops SEAL, Navy SEAL today. You see what I'm saying? It's a job. It's an occupation. It wasn't a people. They were Danish. They were Norse. Okay. They were Swedish. They came from many different places. And these settlers mainly looked for trade routes and connections. They were a trading peoples. Okay, they traded furs, they traded textiles, they traded metal works, crops, maybe baskets and pottery or some, things like that. They were looking for trade routes, they were looking for trade partners. Were they known to raid a monastery? Yes. But that doesn't necessarily define what this culture was or is, because these this culture is still living. Okay, a lot of people still practice the Norse traditions and the, for lack of better term, quote unquote pagan traditions. Okay, the pre-Christian traditions is what I call them. So I just want to make sure that it's pointed out that, one, we say Vikings because that's become a generalizing term, but that is not a defining term for these peoples. And two, these peoples were not all about simply about blood and war and raiding, and they were farmers, they were hunter-gatherers, they were in some cases nomadic. But if they're handed the opportunity to come into some wealth very easily with little personal bloodshed, they're probably not going to turn it down. So getting back to it then, the defense system is set up by Charlemagne and the Frankish Empire to deter Viking raiders. And this defense system basically pushed back Viking attacks for a long time. And there was a raiding party that once again got pushed back in 820. Now, this defense system was set all the way up the Seine River. For those that don't know, the Seine River, it's a river that runs through northern France. And if I'm not mistaken, I want to say it actually runs pretty much right behind Notre Dame Cathedral. I'd have to look at a picture to be 100% on that, just because I don't know if I've actually ever seen a picture of where the cathedral sits, but I want to say that Notre Dame Cathedral sits very close to the river. But anyway, these defense systems were set up going all the way up the river to Paris. And basically what the defense system was it was a series of checkpoints where soldiers would be. And it was also bridges. Bridges were built all the way up the Seine River because it's a lot harder to get a ship or a whole group of ships through a river full of invaders if they have to stop and, account for a bridge. You have to lower your mast, you have to get oars out, you have to row past the bridge, put the mast back up. When you're doing that with a lot of boats, that leaves you exposed. Doing that with a lot of ships, it leaves you exposed. So to have these bridges set up and these checkpoints with soldiers, it was a lot easier for you to, you know, here's a group of soldiers on top of the bridge, maybe hailing arrows down on you, or maybe pouring, hot oil on you or something like that, So this was a pretty solid defense system. And it continued to work well after Charlemagne's passing. Okay. So there was a attack in 820, and the defense system pushed back these Viking raiders. But a little bit further in the future, 834 rolls around, and there's some new attacks from Viking raiders. This time, the defenses started to weaken, and they began to fail. Now, these were just minor. Okay, these weren't very planned attacks. It was just kind of minor. It wasn't, this huge thought out plot. It was more of part of this systematic raiding that had been happening in the English Channel. Now, the biggest thing here is to focus in on the point that those defenses began to fail. Somebody tried it, got through a little bit, maybe got pushed back, okay? They gained an inch, as the term goes. Gain an inch, take a mile, or give an inch, take a mile, okay? These invaders got an inch. And to all the other raiding parties, that went, bet you we can get farther. And that was when this plot started. So, here we are, March 845. There's a fleet of 120 dragon boats. This is the equivalent, estimated to about 4,000 to 5,000 men, that entered the Seine River under command of the chieftain who we today consider to be Ragnar Lothbrok. Now, right around 841, this chieftain had been awarded land. Okay. He was awarded land by Charles the Bald. Charles the Bald was he was a king, okay? He was basically the successor of, if I remember it correctly, he was the successor of Charlemagne's son, if that's right. Yes, so when Charlemagne died, obviously his son would have taken the throne, and then Charles the Bald became the next king after that. And so he had basically gotten involved with this Ragnar earlier during maybe other raids or when they first came to the nation, things like that. And he had awarded him land. This would have been kind of a settlement, okay? The king would have given land for these Norse and Danish settlers to settle on, to build houses and farms and things like that, in hopes that things that were happening in, say, England, with the raids and things like that, wouldn't come to his doorstep. But eventually, Ragnar had lost the land that was given to him by Charles the Bald, and he lost the favor of the king. Okay. So, basically then what happens is Ragnar and his, his Viking raiders or whatever, decide they are going to sack Paris. So they begin traveling up the Seine in 845, sacking different cities and villages and things on their way to Paris. In response to this invasion, Charles the Bald, so this is King Charles, the current King Charles of France at the time, who, I might add, was very determined not to let the Basilica of St. Denis fall. Okay. He basically called up troops, okay, assembled an army, and divided it into two parts. And he said, you're going to be on this side of the river, you're going to be on this side of the river. So here comes, okay, all of these Viking raiders up the river, French forces on either side of the river. Okay. Ragnar attacked and defeated one of the divisions of this Frankish army. Okay, so one of the groups of these French at the time soldiers are defeated. And they took 111 prisoners. Took 111 of these French soldiers as prisoners. And they hung them. Ragnar ordered that these soldiers be hung. They went to this island that is on the Seine, and they hung them. And they did this in honor to the Norse god Odin for bringing them victory and continuing to bring them victory as they went further up the river. And they also did this as a fear tactic to incite terror in the rest of the French forces. So, here we are, Easter Sunday, the 29th of March. Okay? So this is Easter Sunday, the 29th of March, 845. Viking raiders arrive in Paris. They entered the city and they plundered it. During this siege, though, and this is what basically saved the Franks, during the siege, a plague broke out in the Viking camp. The Norse had been exposed to the Christian religion, and after first praying to the Norse gods, they undertook a fast. And they did this after receiving advice from Christian prisoners. And when they fasted, the plague subsided. Now, the Franks could not assemble an effective defense, okay? And the Viking raiders kept pushing forward. They took more and more of the city until eventually Paris fell. And basically, after seeing, the loss of their own people on the side of the Viking raiders, Ragnar approached the king with basically a ransom. Once again, the Franks could not assemble an effective defense, and so the ransom was paid. The Vikings withdrew after being paid a ransom of about 7,000 pounds of silver and gold. Okay. So $7,000 worth of silver and gold, of course, at that time. Charles the Bald pays them. Vikings leave. Now, considering Ragnar's loss of land to King Charles, and basically the reason for him deciding to attack Paris, this was huge. This was a substantial amount of payment. And, you know, the way I see it, and I think the way a lot of historians see it, is the reason more wasn't asked for or something like that, I think, is because the chieftain would have looked at this amount and been satisfied, as it was not only ransom to leave, but also compensation for having land taken from him. Not to mention that they invaded and, conquered, and that satisfied his desire for revenge. And basically after that, there was this agreement, okay? And the agreement was Ragnar and his Viking raiders would leave Paris. Now, they never said they had to leave peacefully. So, what does Ragnar do? Ragnar pillages and raids several sites going down the Seine on his return voyage, raiding once again another abbey, another monastery. Now, after this, okay, the aftermath of this, in the same year, a Viking fleet attacked Hamburg. For those who don't know, Hamburg is a city in Germany. It, at one point, served as a very important city. I don't necessarily know if it was the capital, but I know it was a large city in the Holy Roman Empire. And basically it was sacked by another Viking fleet. And that had been just another step in what was to come. Okay. After that, years down the road, so let's fast forward to 885. There is another siege of Paris. This was a year-long siege by Viking raiders on the city of Paris. And at this point, Paris had become the capital of Francia. Okay. This was the capital city of the kingdom. Okay. And this was a change. It was very notable in history because this was the first time that Viking raiders basically dug themselves in for the long haul. This was a year-long siege. In history, the only things we had seen up to this point were basically hit and runs. Or, there may have been a short, less than a day battle that was fought. This turned into an actual campaign. Okay? And the French pushed them off. Or the Franks pushed them off. Their failure to capture the city was a huge turning point in French history. So once again, we have Ragnar who rode up the Seine and attacked Paris in 845. And, the Vikings continued to return about 3 times in the 860s. And each time they looted the city or they were bought off with bribes. So 845, there's an attack and a raid. We fast forward to the 860s, there's 3 more raids. Okay? In 845 and the 3 times in the 860s, the Vikings were either paid off to leave, or they completely looted the city, or both. In 864, the Franks set up new defense systems, and this consisted of building more bridges across the Seine in order to deter raiding parties. Okay? Because once again, you have to go under those bridges. You have to get around those bridges somehow. And that's hard to do if they can station soldiers at those bridges to rain hellfire upon you. Okay? And so they set up new fortifications. But after setting up these fortifications, the Frankish kingdom was weak and unable to defend itself. So, taking advantage of that weakness, the Vikings attacked Paris again. This was with a large fleet in 885. Okay, the 25th of November, 885. Now, the Duke of Francia, who was in charge of the city at the time, prepared for this attack by building 2 towers. Okay, so 4 towers total. There were 2 towers on each bridge. Okay, so going into the city, it was fortified with 2 footbridges, 2 towers on each bridge. Okay. Now, the Duke's forces were small. We estimate now that his forces were probably no more than about 200 men. But each time, they pushed back Viking raiders. The Vikings would lead an assault on the towers, and they would push them back. Their biggest savior during this: hot tar, hot wax, hot oil. Okay. Pour it on them, burn them, light it on fire, whatever you had to do. This was their biggest helper. The Vikings just couldn't seem to get past it. The Vikings basically requested for tribute. And they obviously, because the Frankish Empire was not going to give them that tribute, were refused. So the Vikings besieged the city. They attacked the northeast tower with catapults, battering rams, other war machines they had at the time, and they set their own ships on fire and ran them into the bridges to try and burn the bridges down. And they just kept pushing through and pushing through and pushing through. Now, the towers continued to hold. Okay? Towers continued to hold. They attacked and attacked and attacked these different towers. But the northeast tower got the most attention. And the northeast tower was captured. Okay? The northeast tower ended up being captured by Viking raiders. But by this time, because it had taken so long, with little to show for it, many of the Vikings had moved on to go pillage the surrounding countryside. That being said, these people in Paris, these soldiers in Paris, took this chance to resupply and seek help. So, after that, during the summer, still in control of the tower, the Vikings decided to make a final attempt at taking the city of Paris once again. But because they had been too focused on the surrounding countryside, and the Frankish army had been reinforcing itself, they were surrounded by Frankish troops. These troops were led by Charles the Fat. Okay, this is also known as Charles the Third. He was the Holy Roman Emperor. He is not typically considered to be a king of France, even though he did control France for a period. Instead, he is more considered the Holy Roman Emperor, but he is recognized as a Frankish king because he did control France for a short period of time. So basically, Charles III brings his army in, surrounds them, and rather than fight them, he gave the Vikings 700 pounds of silver to go away. If they didn't siege Paris and instead set their sights to Burgundy. Burgundy was a region of France that basically was revolting, okay? It was a whole region of the Frankish Empire that was revolting against Frankish rule. So what did the king do? He pays these Vikings 700 pounds of silver, says, you don't attack Paris, and I'll tell you what, I'll give you this money, and I'll let you go attack Burgundy. So they agreed to it. But the citizens of Paris were extremely upset because technically they did lose. The Vikings had made it all this way, and they ended up having to pay them to go away, either that or fight. So the people of Paris took this as a loss. And so they decided they would not allow the Vikings to use the river at all. So the Vikings sail off to Burgundy, raid Burgundy, but they weren't allowed to sail back down the river. So this forced Viking raiders to drag their boats. Drag their boats thousands of feet over land to an area of the river that was outside of the Paris town limits. Yeah. And, then the Vikings continued to later on down the road raid Paris, but, they continued to fail. But yeah, that's the story of Norse raids on Paris. And it's all because of the very first successful raid that was led by who we call Ragnar Lothbrok in today's day and age. He led his 4,000 to 5,000 men to take Paris, to earn a large sum of money, and then they left. And that's the story. That is the story of the Siege of Paris, led by Ragnar Lothbrok, on this day in history in 845. And then, of course, the after effects of that included more raids later on. And the one other thing I wanted to mention about that was that the second siege, okay, the siege that lasted from 885 to 886, that was led by Viking chieftain Rollo. Okay, that was led by Rollo. Now, many people are probably going, if they watch the television series Vikings, wait a minute, weren't Rollo and Ragnar, brothers? What, No, this is not the case. In fact, Ragnar Lothbrok and Rollo were not even close to being the same time. They were completely different life periods. I mean, you can see there's about a 40-year difference between the first siege of Paris and Rollo's campaign. Okay? And by this point, the person that we assumed to be Ragnar Lothbrok was dead. Okay? So the second siege was led by Viking chieftain Rollo, who in the show is Ragnar's brother. This is not historically accurate. This is not true. But another interesting fact about Rollo is that he remained in the Frankish countryside. Okay? After they went and attacked Burgundy, he settled. And he actually, after receiving land in a treaty in 911, he founded Normandy. He founded an entire region where, people of Norse descent or, Norse heritage, they all went and lived on this grant of land with him. And later down the road, this became Normandy, or as Normandy stood for, the land of Norsemen. And the reason he got this land grant from this treaty is because it was payment in exchange for him to protect the region from future Viking raids. And, there were still Viking raids that happened in the Frankish countryside, but Rollo protected Paris, just like he had promised. And for that, Normandy was founded. So yeah, that is the story of Ragnar Lothbrok and his attack on Paris. A little extra right there about Rollo and who he was, the aftermath of these raids, and here we are in the modern day, remembering it all, seeing it happen on very entertaining and graphic television shows. And that's the story. And that's what we know. So thanks everybody for listening to today's podcast. I don't know when I'm going to get my next one out. I know it's been quite some time since the last one that I put out, that this one you're listening to now is coming out, but there will definitely be more content coming. In the meantime, if you haven't done so already, make sure you go back to those other sections and check out our other videos. We have some on American politics. We have some on different people and events in history. Definitely some other videos there you can check out. So everybody have a great day. Have a great night. Have a great rest of your week at whatever point you're listening to this in time. Everybody stay safe. Everybody stay healthy. And I will see everybody next time.